I'm sure that always happens at the margin, but not as something as central as the cancellation of a $90 billion submarine contract with a country as powerful as France and as significant to Australia's interests at France. That, for me, is simply remarkable.
How damaging is it to Australia that this kind of spat is being played out to the point where our Prime Minister has been called a liar?
Well, the point here is that it's not just a spat. We have the President of the United States only a day or two ago indicating plainly in his conversations with the French President that Prime Minister Morrison had misled him about whether or not France had been informed of the decision to unilaterally cancel the $90 billion Australian submarine contract with the French naval group. Then secondly, reinforcing the Biden version of events, you have President Macron stating in the starkest terms possible that he was lied to by Prime Minister Morrison. So when you have a combination of the US President and the French President saying that Prime Minister Morrison has not told them the truth, and in the case of the French President, directly lied to them, this is enormously damaging to Australia's global reputation. It's brand Australia which is at stake here, and that's been a careful investment on the part of successive governments over many generations, Labor and Liberal, in order to cause us to be seen as a reliable, credible and trustworthy international partner.
How do we then make this good? You know, the French, Mr. Macron has said it is up to Australia to make this right again.
My argument all along has been this. If the technical advice to the Australian government is accurate and that the submarine specifications now needed for Australia's national security needs have changed from conventionally powered boats to nuclear-powered boats, in contrast to the ones which I laid out in the Defence White Paper of 2009, then the next most logical thing to do is to extend an open tender to France, the United Kingdom and the United States to bid for the project, rather to unilaterally exclude the French. That is, again, what is wrong with the process here. So I would encourage Prime Minister Morrison to swallow his pride, recognise that he's done the wrong thing here, recognise that he's misled two members of the UN Security Council who are permanent members, quite apart from being close allies and friends of Australia, and do the right thing.
Against this backdrop, we've got Australia being ostracised ahead of COP. Is this fair, given there are other nations, much bigger emitters like China, that are also not committing to these targets?
Well, the bottom line is that there are particular historical obligations flowing to developed countries. And what we've had with Australia is Australia being the absolute last country to sign up to carbon neutrality by 2050, and virtually the only developed economy not to commit to significant additional reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And the reason the latter is important is in order to have a manageable and credible adjustment curve from 2021 to 2030 and on to 2050, rather than what Mr. Morrison is having us believe is that we can just continue to do this and then suddenly do that in the remaining 20 years of the cycle. It makes no public policy sense. Yes, China could have done more, and in terms of its nationally determined contribution, in my judgment, should have done more in this particular COP. But the developed countries have a particular responsibility. And this is where Australia has come again, virtually last in the pack, put together with the French debacle over submarines, the climate change debacle over Australia's negligent performance. Our international reputation is being dragged through the mud by a Prime Minister who simply doesn't care, because on both these questions, he's seen some form of domestic political advantage to be prosecuted through both of them.
Xi Jinping is noticeably absent. Now, COP26 needs consensus from the global leaders. How much of a problem is that?
Look, knowing something about the nature of China's Marxist-Leninist system, Leninist political parties are deeply anxious about the physical security of their leaders. And when you've got a zero COVID environment such as China, they are deeply anxious about allowing, frankly, even foreigners to meet with President Xi in Beijing, let alone allowing him to travel at this stage. Would it be better if he was there? Of course. But his principal negotiator, Xie Zhenhua, who I know particularly well, I've worked with Mr. Xie for the better part of a decade or more, both in government and outside of government, Xie Zhenhua will have a complete understanding of what his political mandate is from the Chinese government. Of course, what Prime Minister Johnson needs as the chair of the conference, or Alok Sharma, his representative, will need, is momentum. He needs momentum from the Americans, further momentum from the Chinese, and people will now be looking at the content of Xi Jinping's speech, if given the content of his nationally determined contribution has been thin and disappointing, but also further actions by, shall we say, recalcitrant governments like Australia to provide that momentum to push towards a greater ambition for 2030, because the ambition gap must be closed. At present, we're only 1/3 of the way there. And if we don't close it, then temperature increases are going to be between 2 and 3 and as high as 4 degrees centigrade by century's end, rather than the 1.5 that we signed up to in Paris.
You talk of Xi Jinping, though, with this COVID paranoia in China, but there's paranoia around Xi Jinping himself, who is also rather fearful that there may be forces mounting against him.
Well, in Chinese domestic politics, the number one event, which everyone is thinking about at present, is the 20th Party Congress, due not this November, but next November. And therefore, this is a critical meeting because congresses occur every 5 years. But for Xi Jinping, having just completed 2 terms, it will be the meeting which determines whether or not he has a 3rd term. And if he's appointed for a 3rd term, he effectively will become leader for life, in my judgment. So the intensity of the internals, as it were, political struggle within Beijing becomes sharper and sharper. On balance, my prediction is that Xi Jinping will prevail because he's a master Machiavellian politician. But I think the resistance will still be reasonable and perhaps even formidable. And so therefore, the intensity of the internals of Chinese politics over the next 12 months is something we should all pay close attention to.
Great to talk, Kevin Rudd. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.